Hello, everyone. Welcome along to our webinar week called Australia's Role in Calibrating and Validating Earth Observations from Ground Sites. So first of all, I want to acknowledge all of the traditional custodians throughout Australia and all nations, and we honour their connections to land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And today I'm very proud to be able to join you from Djibouti country, which is the home of the rain in far north Queensland of Australia. So again, thank you for joining us. And I think I have the statistics. 273 people are joining us today from 12 countries. 18 universities are represented across those countries, and 26 government departments and many other organisations. It's really fabulous that you have come along and joined us. For those that haven't met me, my name is Beryl Morris, and I'm the director of TERN, Australia's Ecosystem Observatory. We're a national research infrastructure project, and our aim is to advance ecosystem science so that we can contribute to the sustainable management of Australia's environment. So just a few little housekeeping things. You'll notice that there's a Q&A button. If you have questions as we go through our webinar today, put those in the Q&A. If you have difficulties with any of the technology, sound, etc., please put it in the chat and we'll try to sort it out from there. And you can also use the chat to talk to each other if you spot somebody in the participants list that you want to call out to. We are recording the webinar today so that those who aren't able to join us for time zone reasons, etc., will be able to catch up, or if you want to refer this webinar to somebody else because it's going to be fantastic. Just need to acknowledge the fact that TERN, our research infrastructure project, is funded by the Australian government through the National Research Infrastructure Strategy for Australia, but we have a lot of partners, our state governments in Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, Western Australia, and TERN is actually a federation of universities across Australia and CSIRO. And we also have some international collaborations, and we certainly wouldn't be able to provide a observatory of ecosystems without such support. So we are going to start meeting the speakers now, and you have got the bios for each of them, and I don't want to take up too much of our valuable time going through that, but just briefly, Matt Garthwaite is from CSIRO, and he's an Earth observation scientist in CSIRO's Centre for Earth Observation, where, amongst other things, he leads the calibration validation facilities development with the intention of enhancing access to Australia's satellite calibration data, which is very relevant. And Megan Lewis, who is fabulously embedded in TERN and a member of our Science Advisory Committee. She is a distinguished environmental scientist specialising in remote sensing and an immediate past president of Earth Observation Australia. She's also the Australian co-chair of the coordinating board of the Asia-Oceania Group on Earth Observations, and she plays a pivotal role in advancing the field. And then we have Will Woodgate, who has been with TERN for many years, and he is an expert in flux tower research and remote sensing technologies, and is the principal investigator of one of our major super sites, Tumbarumba, outside of Canberra, which provides a global benchmark for validating environmental satellite products, and he brings us extensive experience in ground-based validation methods. So I'm going to now let you hear from the speakers as I hand over to Matt Garthwaite. So take it away, Matt.
Thank you, Beryl. Just bring up my slides. You could just confirm that you can see them.
Good, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Beryl. It's great honor to be here today to talk a bit about Earth observation, calibration, and validation. So thanks, Beryl and TERN. I'm Matt Garthwaite, and I work with the CSIRO Center for Earth Observation, where I have two hats. One of those hats is around developing CalVal facilities, as Beryl described. But I'm also a synthetic aperture radar applications expert and have some experience in calibrating SAR systems internationally, and that's kind of relevant, I guess, to this role in CalVal facilities lead. So today I'm just going to give a bit of a high-level overview of Australia's role in the Earth observation CalVal community, and I will also talk through a few opportunities as I see it for Australia to do a bit more. Before I go any further, though, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting today. That's the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. Of course, we're talking about calibration and validation of observation data, which involves being on country to collect data sets to validate satellites. So I think highly relevant that we engage the traditional owners of the lands in these activities, and there's more that we can do going forward in this respect. So I'll start now to give you a bit of background using a report that was recently published by Earth Observation Australia back in April, called The Continuity of Earth Observation Data Supply for Australia. This is the latest in a series of reports that have been done over the years looking at our supply of data that we use for Earth observation studies. And what the study found was that there's 170 government programs as of now that are dependent on Earth observation data across a wide span of domains, which I've listed on the slide here. Of these government programs, almost 80% have financial values of 10 million or more. And the study found that 75% of the programs have what would be considered a high dependency on this data. I interpret that to mean if the Earth observation data was turned off for any reason, the programs would fail. So I think many of you would realize that in Australia, we're entirely dependent on other countries to supply us with Earth observation data. We're still not in the position in this country with our own satellites in space collecting Earth observation data. So we're in a very reliant position. And this is a key risk to a lot of all these 170 government programs. I guess the big risk is that the free supply arrangements that we enjoy with countries like the USA, Europe, and Japan could be turned off at any time, which would strand us in some regards. And this has been seen in the past. Geoscience Australia, a government science agency, signed up an agreement with Japan to access ALOS data and derive services for Australia from this data. But that investment that Geoscience Australia put in was hampered by the fact that Japan decided to change the terms of this bilateral agreement. So we've seen these sort of supply arrangements change quickly in the past, so we need to be very mindful that it could happen again. So I'd like to, I guess, promote CalVal as part of our risk mitigation strategy in Australia. Calibration and validation activities for many years have meant that here in Australia, we can have a meaningful opportunity to engage with international partners. And I know in the presentation following mine by Megan Lewis, she'll talk directly on some of the international partnerships that TERN have had over the years. Also, CalVal gives us a chance to make a material contribution into the EO value chain internationally, given that we don't have our own satellites. I'm not contributing data back to that ecosystem. But what we can do is collect very valuable in situ ground data and contribute that back to the EO community. And we have been doing that for many years. And also in terms of capability and skills within our country, there's great opportunity for individuals to get involved with international partners through mission advisory groups or CalVal science teams by conducting CalVal in Australia. And that's an opportunity that I was lucky enough to have early in my career in a previous role. I was part of the Japanese Space Agency CalVal science team for ALOS-2, and that was a really valuable opportunity for me personally to gain new skills and insights into the EO value stream. So I'd just like to point out, I guess, the difference between calibration and validation. I think we very commonly lump those two terms together into one word, but they are two slightly different things. I think of calibration as relating to the satellite sensor and data coming off of that sensor. And it's in doing that, space agencies who operate these sensors are looking to connect the data to international standards, both by pre-flight calibration and in-flight calibration. So this is a very high-level talk, but this slide contains, I think, the only actual scientific graph, so I hope you enjoy it. It's an example from the MODIS sensor on board two satellites, Terra and Aqua, and it's showing you the degradation through time of part of the sensor suite on board, which is the solar diffuser. So both of these satellites are very large, expensive missions. They have very good provision for onboard calibration, and they're able to monitor the change to that sensor through time, which is really important. I guess that's good for sensors like MODIS, similarly for Landsat Sentinels. But there are many more satellites going into space now that are much smaller and don't have room on board for these high-tech onboard calibration systems. So there's more we can do and support in Australia through vicarious calibration of sensors. And at CSIRO, my colleagues have been involved in implementing a vicarious calibration site in Western Australia, which is part of an international initiative called RADCALNet, the Radiometric Calibration Network, connected with CEOS, the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites. And what this Radiometric Calibration Network does is provide free and open access data to anyone, satellite operators, so they can keep track of the sort of issues to do with sensor degradation through time. So that's a little bit on calibration. Validation is the other part of that CalVal word, and I see that as relating to the derived EO product. So taking data that comes off the sensor, doing a bunch of additional processing effort to then produce a product that makes sense geophysically in terms of a geophysical measurement. And I think this is the bulk of what we do in Australia now, is around validating the products we're producing off of data from some of these international missions like Landsat, MODIS, etc. It's really important to do this work so that we understand the uncertainties on the measurements we know from space, and importantly, particularly if we're using these global products, finding out how applicable these products are in Australian conditions. You know, we have a very large and diverse continent, as stylized in this image here, with lots of different environments. I think more often than not, we find that the global products do not work for Australia out of the box, and that means it's really important for us to invest in understanding how those products can be tweaked to make most sense in our country. Moving on to some of Australia's contributions, you know, as I've pointed out, we're already well known internationally for contributing in Earth observation CalVal. Part of that is around operating instrumented sites, and this map is showing a collection of, I should say, an incomplete collection, I think, of sites around the country that are collecting data of some type, which can be useful for EO CalVal. Principal among them are the red points, which are TERN's OzFlux and super sites. which collect a lot of data, which has been of great use, and we'll hear more about from Megan Lewis. But it's not just about instrumented sites, it's also about capability that we have in Australia through skills and expertise that have developed in individuals, in organizations, which we can contribute back, and undertaking important activities like CalVal campaigns through time. And again, I think we will hear a bit more from Megan about a recent campaign that was done, a collaboration across many of the groups with logos on this screen, called the Strix for Veg, which is a surface reflectance intercomparison exercise for vegetation. And that's a great example of expertise in the country coming together to further the validation of vegetation products. So now, with time wrapping up, I'll just go through a few opportunities I think we have as a nation to improve what we do in the CalVal space. We're already doing really well, but there's always places where we can do more. The first one of them is around increasing visibility of everything we do, and also, of course, improving access to the data as the fundamental asset that we generate through our activities. So in particular, making sure that we align our data to the FAIR principles, making it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is something we could improve. Also, I think we can do more to coordinate across stakeholder groups. Earth observation touches a large gamut of activities. And TERN is an example of one place in ecosystems research which is really well coordinated. But then we can also do more to coordinate with other research infrastructure networks like IMOS, or the activities in universities and organizations like CSIRO. And I think an important part about that is looking for ways to improve the efficiency of these data collection mechanisms, ensuring they're sustainable in the long term, and maybe even moving towards treating them as mission critical infrastructure for EO. My next point is around translating the data that we do collect on the ground to something that Earth observation scientists can more readily use out of the box. So, TERN already collects a lot of data, for example, but it has that ecosystem science flavor to it. Are there some additional simple processing steps that we could do to transform that into maybe a analysis-ready data format that is then more directly ingestible into the workflows of Earth observation scientists? The fourth point here is around aligning our CalVal data, our in-situ data, with international standards. I mentioned already the community, the CEOS, the Community on Earth Observation Scientists, which is an international working group of space agencies, essentially working together to uplift usage of data. And they have this initiative called Fiducial Reference Measurements for EO, which is essentially taking CalVal data and putting more rigor around the uncertainty estimation of the data, and applying metadata standards to ensure they're more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable going forward. So we could do more in that space to align our data, or also develop our own protocols, and the Strix for Veg activity is a good example of that. The fifth one there is about leading more international collaboration activities. I've already mentioned Strix for Veg twice. I won't labor that point anymore. We could look at the technology trends available to us to innovate on data collection in CalVal. And I think the key areas here, TERN is already doing a lot moving forward. So harnessing UAVs or drones to collect data, particularly over sites that are not easy for people to access, and like vegetated sites, to collect data above canopies, and automating data collection so that it's moving much more towards a mission critical infrastructure. The final point here is just touching on what I mentioned earlier around collaborating more with traditional owners of the lands. So finding opportunities for Aboriginal corporations to be collecting data and putting it into land management practices that they're interested in. Something else that's worth mentioning is that earlier in the year, it was announced that Australia will be joining the Landsat Next program. So in the federal budget in May, Geoscience Australia was appropriated a big investment of money to lead the contribution to Landsat Next. I think that's really exciting. It means that secures our access to Landsat Next data going forward, and Landsat's already a really critical part of the EO value stream for us. I think in CalVal particularly, there's opportunities for us to help the USGS in validating their level 2 products, particularly terrestrial surface reflectance and their new aquatic reflectance products going forward. So there are opportunities we can look to get involved there. There's also, in case you hadn't noticed, a boom in the number of commercial satellite missions going into space. Some are large, some are small. Most of them don't have their own plans to collect in situ validation data, but would be happy and very willing to take data from us all and make sure that they can quality assure the products that they're developing and trying to sell back to us in Australia, be it in government, academia, or industry. So just the final thing I wanted to mention is I'll touch on what we're doing in CSIRO. What we're looking to do is establish a CalVal consortium, which we're calling AusCalVal. What the idea of this consortium is to try and start advancing some of these opportunities on behalf of domestic stakeholders. So in the short term, we're looking to put together a consortium of interested stakeholders, and through time, as indicated in the diagram here, grow that into maybe in the future a national facility that sustains the operation of mission critical EO infrastructure, but in the shorter term, tries to federate access to data, promote what we do in Australia, look for opportunities for people and organizations in Australia to leverage international initiatives and that sort of thing. So that's what we're working on. And my final slide is just to promote that we hope to run a stakeholder workshop at the AEO Forum in Adelaide in September. We haven't heard whether this is accepted yet, but hopefully it will be. And I invite anyone interested to come along to that workshop and let us know what you think the common needs are from your perspective in Earth observation CalVal and how a consortium could potentially help with those. So if you want to hear any more about that, please reach out to me at the email address there. Happy to talk to you more about that. So thank you again, Beryl and TERN, for the opportunity to speak today. And I will pass the baton to Megan Lewis to speak next.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Matt. You've provided a very nice context and pointers to quite a number of points that I'm going to cover. Thank you, Beryl, for the opportunity of being part of this webinar as well. If I were at home, I'd be acknowledging the Ghana people and their land, but in fact, I'm joining the webinar from England, UK, where I'm in Wiltshire, and acknowledging the traditional owners here could be quite a long and involved story. So I'll cut to the chase of talking about CalVal. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting some highlights from TERN's activities in the CalVal space. And a lot of these are very nice illustrations of some of the points that Matt has already mentioned. TERN has a long history of developing infrastructure, supporting activities, and developing what are now very substantial data streams across all of its platforms. And a lot of that is relevant to CalVal in different sorts of ways. TERN has and continues to have many connections to international networks and EO validation programs. So out of these, I'm going to highlight a few examples And I know that Will Woodgate is going to provide more specific detail about some of those. So the first thing I'd like to mention is this calibration and validation handbook that TERN coordinated and brought together in 2018. Now this is a compilation of guidelines for effective CalVal of satellite data, and it links Australian activities to international best practice and standards. Something that's particularly noteworthy and useful about the handbook is that it brought together community contributions from wide-ranging experts and practitioners, and it brought together information that had been quite dispersed up until then in publications, technical reports, guides, and sometimes, laboratory recommendations. So bringing those together into one place certainly has been very useful. The handbook is wide-ranging. It has 19 chapters, including a review of international and Australian standards for satellite validation, and it has guidelines outlining the general principles of designing ground surveys and measurements, but also quite a lot of specific ones that relate to particular sorts of imagery, multispectral, hyperspectral, radar and LiDAR, and also to collection of data to validate for particular biophysical properties or land cover products. Now, the authors of the handbook have always seen it as a dynamic document. It was intended as a starting point for information and bringing together current state of knowledge to promote discussion and improvement. And given how rapidly this field is moving, there's certainly scope for this handbook to be updated and expanded to bring in new practices, new guidelines, and so on. I'll now move on and mention the TERN super sites, which are perhaps the flagship or the TERN facility that most people think of when we talk about CalVal. These are a select small number of sites around Australia that are very intensively instrumented with flux towers and associated instruments that are measuring atmosphere and ecosystem energy, carbon and water exchanges. And those flux towers and aerial instruments are surrounded by survey plots that have been very thoroughly characterised with biological and ecological measurements, vegetation, fauna, microbial activity, hydrology, and so on. And although there's only a limited number of these, they are well distributed, sampling a range of Australian biomes and conditions. Now, in the context of CalVal, it's important to note that 13 of those sites are recognised by the International Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, their CalVal working group, as part of the International Reference Network for validating satellite land products. Now, this international network has contributions and sites from a large number of countries, a large number of organisations, and the working group has some quite stringent criteria for sites to make the grade, if you like, as part of this network. I've listed them here: ongoing measurements, consistency of measurements, and the simultaneous measurement of many biophysical properties. So it's certainly noteworthy and a credit to TERN that these super sites have been selected to be part of this network, but it's also noteworthy that they're considered amongst the top sites in that network in terms of the quality of data that they're providing. The TERN super sites are also a focal point for a lot of collaborations, further collaborations in many international EO validation programs. I've listed them, or some of them here. There are many more. Will is going to pick up on some of these and provide some more specific examples. Now, while the super sites are a small number of sites providing very detailed temporal data and very detailed specialist data about their associated plots, TERN has also developed the surveillance plots network. This was established in 2012, and since then it's grown to include over 1,000 sites, very widely distributed across Australia, as you can see from the map there, and with quite a number of the sites now having had repeat surveys. At these sites, vegetation cover and composition, soil properties, and a number of other environmental attributes are measured following standardised protocols. Now, it's obvious that that data is of great value to many ecological applications, but it's worth noting that that surveillance plot network and the design of the surveys was designed with satellite image validation in mind. An example of that sort of use I've highlighted here in this article that was published in Science a few years ago. TERN surveillance data contributed to lots of validation data for a satellite-derived mapping of forests in drylands around the world. So that's a nice example of Australian TERN site data contributing to international validation efforts. Now that the surveillance network has grown to this extent, there's certainly scope for wider use of its records for validation of land cover and composition, and for a wider range of essential ecological variables. I think we'll see more of this activity in future. Now, I'll move on to a point that Matt also flagged, which is that technology that's used and available for validation and calibration is constantly evolving, and drones are emerging as important platforms and tools in this space. A lot of the on-ground validation of Earth observation data and products, and some of the vicarious calibration that takes place to date, relies on calibrated instruments. It relies on people having to access remote sites in difficult conditions, take measurements in very restricted windows of time to coincide with satellite overpasses. And an example of a recent exercise was a national coordinated effort that brought many people together to collect this sort of on-ground surface reflectance data to validate the new Landsat products for Digital Earth Australia. Anybody who's been involved in that knows how hard that data is to obtain. And so perhaps it's natural that there's growing interest in the use of drones to provide new ways of collecting that sort of data. But because that field is so rapidly moving, everybody has been working out their own ways of doing that to date. And so it's in that context that the SRIX for Veg project has been developed. Matt mentioned this. This is a program that has been or is being supported by the CEOS Working Group on CalVal, the European Space Agency, and lots of international collaborators, including many in Australia. And the point of this exercise is to develop international standards for drone surface reflectance measurements, and to draw on all of that expertise in the international community to pull together best practice guides. And by understanding the variability in these measurements that's associated with different sensors, different protocols and so on, different atmospheric conditions, to allow harmonization of measurements from different sources, and hence make collection of this sort of validation data easier and more efficient. Now, the Strix for Veg campaign or exercise was started with a campaign in Spain in 2021, and earlier this year it was followed with a second campaign at Calibrating Station in South Australia on the floodplain of the River Murray. Australia hosted this, and Australian teams from Australian government, state governments, universities and companies participated, and the site was chosen because it is a very well characterised TERN surveillance site, and because it's in close proximity to a TERN and one of the CEOS super site measurement locations. And the challenge at this site was to collect drone-based reflectance data over a complex natural vegetation target. And the exercise involved round-robin intercomparisons of surface reflectance collected by the different teams, operating different hyperspectral sensors, different drone platforms with their own protocols, and to compare those with the traditional on-ground spectroradiometers and other instruments. And Matt flagged the workshop that CSIRO is promoting in association with the Advancing Earth Observation Forum in Adelaide in September, but I also understand that there's going to be, or that the organisers of the Strix for Veg campaign are hoping and proposing a follow-up workshop where some of the results of that will be presented at that event as well. So that's something else to keep an eye out for. So to finish up, I'm sorry, I've clicked. To finish up, also talking about drones and their role in CalVal, TERN is supporting a number of initiatives that will expand drone imaging to the surveillance plot network, and this will provide a permanent record of cover conditions at those sites, and it will open up the way for new methods for characterising cover and composition from the drone high-resolution imagery, and bridge the scale between the current on-ground measurements and satellite data. And I believe that this bridging of the gap will enhance the use of that site data for many more validation applications. And TERN is also supporting hyperspectral and LiDAR data, very specialised, high-quality data for the super sites, which will also enhance their role and expand their use to support validation for new satellite missions. So I think on that note, I'll finish and hand over to Will Woodgate, who I know is going to pick up a number of these points and talk about them in more detail. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being involved.
Thanks very much, Megan, and thanks everyone for having me. And thanks for Matt and Megan for a wonderful national and international perspective. So I'm going to dive deeper down to the site scale with a broad cross-section of examples where Tumbarumba TERN site feeds into CalVal activities. So this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind trip in order to keep time, so feel free to reach out to me afterwards for more information. And as Megan pointed out, importantly, Tumba, along with other TERN sites, are ranked among the top globally sites to support land product validation activities from satellite products. I'd like to thank collaborators at Melbourne Uni, CSIRO UQ, ANU New South Wales Forestry Corporation, and many more institutes that make this work possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I speak today. This is the Kabi Kabi people near Noosa. So the Tumbarumba TERN site is in its 24th year of continuous operation, mostly. It's located in southern New South Wales in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains in a tall, productive eucalypt forest that's been managed for timber production for over 100 years. So it survived and monitored major disturbance events such as insect attacks, droughts, heat waves, lightning strikes, and now a major bushfire in 2019, 2020. And that's what we see some of these photos here depict. So now we have a wonderful opportunity to monitor the recovery of such a system to bushfire. And unfortunately, within Australia, it's now somewhat representative of many forests that have been struck by fire. So the Tumba site is part of a global network of flux tower sites. It's one of the longest running sites in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's used quite frequently for linking to remote sensing data products, especially for mapping carbon use or carbon uptake and water use, both regionally to global. If it was a researcher, it's been part of over 150 international peer-reviewed publications. It's been cited over 21,000 times. And you can just note here that the top two citations or publications with the most citations link the water fluxes that we measure on the ground to satellite products for regional to global scale estimations of water use. So it's a long and storied history in contributing to this space. So I'd like to start our journey by traveling 1.5 million kilometers away from the surface of the Earth to NASA's Deep Space Observatory. And this is an example where researchers from Tartu Observatory in Estonia have linked on-the-ground measurements of canopy structure to the satellite data to give inferences of canopy structure from space. Coming down a bit closer to Earth, we have the International Space Station, around 400 kilometers above the Earth, which hosts the JEDI sensor, which is a spaceborne LiDAR sensor run by NASA. And JEDI stands for the Global Ecosystem Dynamic Investigator. So what we can see here is pictured on the right-hand side is a vertical profile of canopy density. And we can see two different lines representing before and after the fire, showing a large reduction in canopy density from the fire. Next to the right-hand side, we've got terrestrial laser scanning data. So in situ measurements of the same variable, but at much higher spatial detail. And we can use these measurements to understand the uncertainties and also potentially improve the products that are produced from this JEDI spaceborne LiDAR mission, highlighting the importance of in situ data that's critical to validate such spaceborne observations. Sticking with the LiDAR theme, this is an example of an in situ autonomous laser scanner. And thanks very much, Darius Colvin at Environmental Sensing Systems and Glenn Uniman at CSIRO for this at Tumbarumba. So we have here, Tumbarumba is now part of a new global network of in situ LiDAR scanners, which give us autonomous measurements of canopy structure at the daily resolution of detail. So there's unprecedented resolution to capture fine spatial and temporal changes in canopy structure down to 1 to 2% canopy cover level of precision. Also on the LiDAR front, LiDAR is now recognized as the gold standard for indirectly estimating above ground woody biomass. And so what we see here is part of a collaboration with CSIRO, where all of the TERN super sites, the core sites, have been measured with high resolution ground-based LiDAR to produce, as an extension of this project, 3D measurements or 3D metric models of 1 hectare plots down to 1 centimeter branch level of detail. And so this technique is designed and hoped to supplement traditional forest inventory techniques. And here we've followed the GeoTrees international protocol for data collection. A continuation of this project is now expanding the terrestrial measurements to UAV LiDAR measurements. So instead of being able to measure at single hectare scales, we're now being able to measure at hundreds of hectare scales, again, following international protocols. So what we have here is an example of a Fletcher View rangeland site, which has been processed through some new algorithms to produce these 3D volumetric models to give us a really accurate above ground biomass. And so this is part of a project of visiting all the sites, all the core TERN super sites with this UAV LiDAR, following the same protocol. So we have a really standardized data set with the same sensor and same algorithms that can be used to link to satellite data to improve our biomass estimates. Sticking with the canopy structure theme, this is an example of a collaboration with our European collaborators as part of the European Space Agency's Copernicus satellite fleet, where we've collected on-the-ground measurements of canopy structure with hemispherical photography, which is pictured here. We can see here an example of before and after the fire, which shows changes in canopy density or plant area index and leaf area index. This is part of a broader collaboration with our European colleagues, where it's part of the ground-based observation for validation of land products, or GBOV, and GBOV focus on 7 core land products. 6 of them are listed here, and crucially, we collect all 6 of these and the 7th at Tumbarumba to share with our European colleagues, so we can crucially get Australian data into global products to make sure that these global products perform reasonably well over Australian conditions. The 7th variable was surface reflectance, and this is part of some work conducted at CSIRO, and a big thank you to Dale Hughes, who's now at ANU, who developed a hyperspectral and thermal imaging system that sat on top of the tower to autonomously record high spatial and temporal resolution data that fills a gap that the satellites have in terms of that resolution. However, technology changes very quickly, so now we're seeing the satellites close the gap with new small fleets of satellites flying over, reducing the temporal and spatial resolution gap. It's getting closer. This is an example of some of the outputs from the system in terms of high resolution imagery of the hyperspectral and thermal imager. And what this has helped us do is develop retrieval algorithms that work in Australian conditions to help us retrieve phenology metrics and also productivity proxies that we link to the flux tower. An extension of this work has been instrumenting the site with the ability to measure solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, which is more directly related to photosynthesis. And this is part of an initiative where there are now 50 sites instrumented globally that measure SIF. And that's also linked to the European Space Agency's FLEX SIF mission, which is planned for launch next year. So the data here has helped to understand and improve SIF retrieval methods, and also to help interpretation of satellite SIF products. Also, a big thank you to CSIRO, who operate an AeroNet aerosol observatory close to the site, which is crucial for minimizing a large source of error when linking ground measurements to the satellite, which is the atmospheric composition. Another example of work at the site down to the leaf level of detail is here's pictured an activity where we collect leaf level spectra and also the pigment composition, so the foliage chemistry of the leaves. And we've used that to recalibrate a model so we can better link spectral reflectance, which is what we can see from different scales above the canopy into the satellite, with what's happening inside the leaf, for example, to estimate chlorophyll concentration. And critically here, Australian species are underrepresented in the model parameterizations. So here we've been able to recalibrate this model to Australian conditions, specifically for the eucalypt species at this flux tower site. So a big thank you to UTAS collaborators for this work. Going up the scale to UAV, this example here is part of a collaboration with UTAS Terraluma Group. So a big thank you, ARCO. And this is about scaling leaf level metrics and understanding canopy traits at a really high spatial resolution, where the drones fill a spatial gap between the satellite and what's happening at the leaf level. This is an example here of using some of the flux tower data in terms of productivity in the green time series, which is the total carbon uptake from the flux tower, and comparing that against typical greenest metrics from satellites. So from the Sentinel-2 series, as well as the tropomu-SIF signal. So here at the fire at Tumbarumba has given us an opportunity to understand how well these signals are suited to monitoring the recovery of the vegetation and carbon uptake of these different satellite signals. And so this work is under review, but it's crucial to understand how we can monitor our recovering ecosystems from space. And finally, I'm very excited about this new development at the site. So this is a picture of our new walk-up tower, which has replaced the old guide butt-mast tower, meaning that researchers can now more easily get access to the tower to do their experiments, and also for UAV access where people need to have line of sight for safe operation of their UAVs. So this future-proofs the site, and it's exciting times ahead for Tumbarumba. So thank you very much, Beryl. I'll hand back to you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Will and Megan and Matt. And perhaps if you could just put your cameras back on, so because we'll tackle some questions. So that last slide, Will, with the new walk-up tower, I know that that's not quite commissioned yet. We're going to have a party after the snow finishes. But there is a question in the Q&A from Carolyn Poulsen that asks about more co-location of measurements at super sites. Is that what we're getting to? And will that new tower give us an opportunity to do more things from that tower?
Definitely. The idea is this infrastructure is available to everyone within reason. And the walk-up tower gives us the ability to have people not require a 2-day training course to climb and rescue people from towers. So yes, that's the intention, is to make everything co-located, because when we add more and more data streams, we get a much richer idea of what's happening with our ecosystems. And then that definitely helps interpret what's happening from the spaceborne perspective and above canopy perspectives.
And you've also not had a chance to see Edmund Sue's question, which is what's the finest scale we can get down to with LiDAR on a drone for above ground biomass? So
Great question. So the drone platform we're using is from CSIRO, which is one of the highest spec platforms, and we're collecting data at around 8,000 points per square meter, which is overkill a lot of times to get the canopy structure level of detail that we need. We often downsample that.
I'll let you have a look at Robbie Ramsey's question just for a sec while I ask Matt. You've talked about being the people interested, maybe the people on this webinar coming together in Adelaide at the Australian Earth Observation Forum 2024, which I think is the 10th to the 12th of September. So they need to register for the forum and then register for that workshop. Is that how we go about it?
I think I'm not sure. I think you don't need to register for the main forum to attend a workshop. The workshops will be on the Monday and the Friday, and it hasn't been announced which workshops will go ahead, but I think they're mutually exclusive. Maybe Megan knows something more.
Yes, Matt and Beryl, anybody can attend and register the workshops, and I expect that there'll be an announcement very soon, perhaps later this week or early next week, with preliminary details of the talks within the main forum and also the workshops. We know there have been quite a number of submissions, so I think the announcement of those will be out very soon. And I think I'm right in saying that it's possible to register for the workshop, even if you're not attending all or part of the forum, but fuller programs the registration is already available, but the fuller program will be available, I'd say, in the next week.
And Megan, you're on many of these international bodies, etc. And well, I read out a couple in your bio. So it's a really tricky space. Just looking at the 3 presentations today, it's really obvious to me about how many different disciplines are involved, how many different institutions. Will was thanking people all over the place. And, you know, just reminding me, TERN really is a federation of everyone. And that's what it is. It's everyone joining together. So we've got multiple scales, multiple institutions, multiple countries. How do we actually get, you know, not be inefficient? How do we bring it all together? What's the best coordination of it all?
Well, I guess Matt is in talking about steps towards a national facility. We're going to be tackling those in Australia, certainly, but you're right, internationally it's huge. And TERN, through the examples that Will's presented, and I'm aware of others, is subject to numerous and quite often uncoordinated requests. Can you provide data for this? Can you provide data for that? Or could you add new measurements? The CEOS working group, CalVal working group, is very well established and has, well, not reputation, it is recognised as the coordinating body for these things. And Australia is very well represented in that, but I think we perhaps need to actively work with them to pose these problems and say, yeah, we need more coordination from them as well. So we do have Australian representatives, CSIRO representatives on those committees, and we have them at quite high levels. They have chaired it at various times in the past. So I think we should, in the first instance, use our connections there to firm up and perhaps expand our interaction with that international committee would be my thought. Matt, you've no doubt got ideas as well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Megan, that CEOS membership is by organisation, and for Australia, both Geoscience Australia and CSIRO are CEOS members, and you know both of us, being GA and CSIRO, are very active in the working group on CalVal that's been mentioned, and that working group on CalVal has a number of subgroups that are more specific on various disciplines, and Megan mentioned the land product validation subgroup in her presentation, and that attending the workshops and plenaries organised by those subgroups is not limited to member organisations. So your TERN could represent, for instance, at the land product validation subgroup. So I think these are excellent forums to stay connected with the international sphere.
And Will, the last question is for you. You showed all the incredible citations and things like that. I think the H index of Tumbarumba is way up there with the best in the world. So obviously, you would say that our ability to get something meaningful for Australia from Earth observation is dependent on how much we put in. Do you want to just comment on that?
I think the two are very closely linked. Yes. Yeah. Earth observation is just how we scale these measurements across the breadth of Australia, which is huge, and it'd be great to see more representative sites as well. We do a great job at the moment, but as a scientist, we get greedy and would always like to be collecting more.
Right. That's great. So TERN will continue to support this area because we do rely so much on Earth observation data, and Australia is so unique that I think that we want to make sure that we can fish as much as we can out of Earth observation data. Thank you very much, Matt, Megan, Will, and also thank you to our incredible audience who've made it interesting for us to be here, and all the questions that we've got. We'll pick some of the ones that haven't been answered up and send answers direct to those. And I just want to point out that we do have more webinars coming up this year. So please do join us in September and then again in November for the rest of them. And now we're going to say goodbye, and thank you once again for everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Beryl. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the chance to be involved.